Today's scripture passage is Luke 16, 1 through 12. You're welcome to turn in your Bibles or follow along on the screen behind me. The parable of the shrewd manager. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can no longer be manager.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? The master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will come to me in their houses.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 900 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are most shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own?" This is God's word.
Thank you, Robin. We have a saying, and I'm wondering if you can complete the sentence. Good help is hard to find. You guys are all over that. Now, those of you who have ever tried to run a business or who are running a business currently, you probably know better than anybody else the truth of that little maxim, don't you? Or if you have ever hired a contractor to come and clean out your gutters or redo your landscaping or fix your appliance, you probably have had the same experience. That sometimes the standards of the person who comes to do work for you are not as high as yours, the one who's paying for the service. Good help is hard to find. Now, what's interesting is that the parable that you just heard read for you finds a fictitious business owner 2,000 years ago having the same problem: poor employee production. Now, I will tell you that this particular parable of Jesus is a surprising one. It's even what I might call a troubling one. This actually is one of the first, this parable was the text for one of the first sermons I ever gave. It was funny because I always was fascinated with this parable. And the guy who was pastoring the church when I gave one of these, my first sermons, he said to me afterwards, "You young guys, you always like to pick the most complicated passages." And I think there's probably truth to that. There's something that's really, it just seems off about this parable until you are able to pull it apart and grasp what it's trying to say. I do think that at first blush, you and I, by the way, I should ask you, is anybody here hearing this parable for the first time? Okay, we've got a couple of people who are hearing this parable for the first time, so it seems a little bit weird. And even if you have heard it before, it probably still seems a little bit weird to you. And I would say that if you or I were the ones to write or make up this parable, we probably would have had it end quite differently than Jesus told to end it. It leaves us scratching our heads, I would say. It's probably one of the least understood parables of all the parables that Jesus taught, and there were a good number of them. Now, traditionally, this parable has been known as the parable of the unjust steward. What's another word for unjust? Unrighteous, wicked, unfair. Yeah, kind of a little shifty, Now, the NIV in its translation, no, it's not actually a translation. They're using fresher language when they give it the heading. By the way, the headings are not originally there in the Bible, so when you see a heading like that, like Robin prefaced the reading with, that is supplied by the editors So they just let you know that a change is coming here. But they have chosen to call it the parable of the shrewd manager. Yeah, it's a pretty good translation, or not. It's a pretty good characterization. Now, this parable actually draws upon part of an ancient culture that is distant from ours, so that it's kind of hard for us to grasp some of the main concepts. So, in other words, when I ask you, what is a steward? You know, we don't really have stewards. I mean, having been a high schooler in the 70s, I remember the Love Boat. Remember the Love Boat? Anybody here remember the Love Boat? Okay, yeah, and there was a ship's steward whose name was Gopher. Come on, you guys, okay? Well, we're not talking about a gopher-like person here. Back in the ancient world, a wealthy or a powerful man would turn over often the running of his affairs to a trusted individual that he would call his steward. Now, the thing of it is the Greek language there doesn't use the word steward. That's an English word to try to encompass what the Greek word actually meant. And I'll put the Greek word on here because I think it's a fascinating word. Oikonomos, okay? Oikonomos is the Greek word, and it's a compound word, as many words are. And does anybody recognize the first part of the word? There's a product that you can buy, yogurt, okay? Okay, and it's the name of a brand of yogurt, oikos. Oikos. And it literally means, it can be translated a number of different ways, but most usually it means house or household, okay? Now the second part of the word is nomos, which is the Greek word for law. So what we're talking about here is the person in the household who is the law, the person who runs stuff in the household. So now you can see why we translate it as a steward, but I struggle because it doesn't really carry the weight of it for me, steward, okay? I tried, well, how about power of attorney? Does that work? Probably not. You might try personal secretary or personal administrator or personal assistant, something like that. But none of them carry the weight of what a steward was. If you really want to see what a steward was like in the ancient world, you could turn sometime on your own time to Genesis chapter 39 and read the description of a man named Joseph, who was a son of Jacob. Okay, and remember, he was sold into Egypt as a slave, and because of his great faithfulness and his great gifts and his willingness, he rose into stewardship in a household of a very prominent Egyptian official whose name was Potiphar. And it's interesting that the Bible actually says in Genesis 39 that Joseph was so much in control of everything in Potiphar's world that Potiphar didn't have much to think about except what he was going to eat for dinner that night. Okay? So, this steward in this parable is a man who's been entrusted with the running of all of the affairs of this very wealthy landowner. And he probably didn't have much to think about either except what he wanted for dinner that night. And of course, he probably didn't have to prepare it either. Anyway, so this is a steward. Now, verse 1 of Luke chapter 16 tells us who the audience was for this parable. And it's always important to figure out who Jesus is speaking a parable to. You can't always figure it out with clarity, but many times it tells you straight out. So Jesus is speaking directly to his disciples in this parable. He's not speaking to other people. He's speaking to his disciples. However, we don't know whether that's the 12, the small group, or whether that's an extended group of disciples. And I will also tell you this. It's very clear by reading what follows the parable that there were religious leaders within earshot. And frankly, I think very often Jesus did this. He spoke the parable to his followers with the full intention that other people would hear it, with the full intention that the Pharisees would hear it. And it wasn't even really overhearing it. You ever known how people do that sometimes? They're talking to maybe they're talking to you, but they're really intending for somebody else to hear it. Okay, I think that's what you've got going on here, even though Jesus is talking directly to his disciples. Now, 4 key components to this parable before we begin to tear the thing apart. I want you to watch for 4 key components, and there are probably more, but these stood out to me. First, obviously, the wealthy landowner. And why is the guy wealthy and powerful? Probably because he owns a heck of a lot of land. He owns vast amounts of acreage, which, if you follow the parable, he seems to be leasing out to farmers who then farm those fields and have a predetermined lease payment. They have a lease payment due, which is a predetermined portion of what they raise on that man's lands. Now, does that remind you of anything in American history? Sharecropping? It's basically sharecropping is all it is. It's sharecropping, okay? And so every so often they have a certain amount of produce that they have got to provide for the landowner in return for him allowing them to farm his acreage. So he's wealthy because of his vast estates, vast acreage, all right? Now that's the first piece, the wealthy landowner. The second component of this parable that you need to keep track of is the steward, which we've already talked about, so we won't talk about that again. You know what the steward is basically. Now there's a third component that I think is important in this parable that is not it's not so objective. It's a little bit more subjective. And it is the idea of responsibility. You can't read this parable without realizing that there's some responsibility involved in this parable. What was the responsibility? The landowner gave responsibility to the steward for the running of everything. He was responsible with certain expectations for productivity, for representing the interests of the landowner well. He was responsible even to a certain degree for the reputation of the landowner. He's responsible. There's a lot of responsibility on this man's shoulders, okay? Don't miss that part. Now, the fourth component that I think is very important goes hand in hand with the responsibility, and it's the word accountability. You can't read the parable without realizing there's some accountability going on in this thing. What is the accountability? There is an understood accounting to be given for the performance of the steward. Well, the performance, or shall we say the non-performance of the steward. Those you got at least those four things working here. Now, why do I think it's important to point those things out to you? Look on the screen. I think it's important that we realize that this parable, and much of the New Testament for that matter, uses this multi-thousand-year-old Near Eastern cultural phenomenon of stewardship to do what? To paint a picture for us of something. It paints a picture for us of our relationship to God. Now, that's not very hard to see. The landowner is a picture of God. He owns it all. You and I, then, are stewards given a responsibility by God to do something with his interests in this world with an understood accounting to be given. So that's the basic gist of it there. Now, let's begin to pull the parable pull it apart a little bit. And I kind of want to retell it in my own words because it really helps me a lot, and maybe it'll be helpful to you. I'm going to have splashed up on the screen here an artist rendition of this steward sitting down with one of the farmers, and let it try to jog your imagination as we go here. See if you can track. So in the parable, Jesus is talking about a wealthy landowner who's hired a steward to run everything. And apparently, this landowner is not what we would call a micromanager. How do I know that? Well, because a report had to be brought to him about the performance of the steward. He wasn't sitting there looking down the neck of the steward all the time. He wasn't trying to control everything. Somebody brought a report to him that the steward basically was really messing up big time. All right, so he heard that. And I also remembered that, this idea of a landowner who's given responsibility for his stuff to a steward, that's a very common theme in the stories that Jesus told. This is not the only one where he used that imagery. And very often, Jesus would tell a story about the wealthy landowner who traveled extensively in far-off lands and had very little to do with the steward, actually. And so I think probably what we've got going on here is Jesus drawing on a very common practice. So apparently it was not unusual for these landowners to be absent a lot of the time, traveling far off. So I would assume then that in this parable, this landowner has probably been doing some fairly extensive traveling, and somehow he gets word that stuff at home is going south. Stuff at home is not being handled well by the man he left in charge. So he comes back and he's going to take some action. Now, I remember, and this is just sort of a rabbit trail, I remember when my kids were young, they were entering into mid-high and then into high school, trying to help them understand certain things about the way you want to be known in this world, okay? I thought, okay, I would tell them, it's very important that you develop a reputation of being a person who is dependable, who works hard, always does what is asked of you. Nobody has to ever wonder if you're going to show up or not. And actually, it will serve you really well if you always do a little bit more than you're asked to do. You give a little bit more, and I guarantee you, you're really never going to have a hard time finding work. If you are faithful, if you are dependable, you always do what is asked of you and maybe a little bit more, you're probably not going to struggle with being unemployed too often or for very long. It's just, it's kind of like a proverb. It's not a promise. It's just the way things generally work, okay? I don't know whether they ever got that or not, but it made me think about this steward. Apparently, nobody ever taught him that. Now, in the parable, the landowner comes back and he confronts the steward. Now, it strikes me that the steward never tries to argue with him. The steward never tries to say, no, wait a minute, it's not really like that. It's this so-and-so is... No, there's no blame shifting. There's no trying to spin it. There's nothing. So apparently he is guilty as charged. He knows it. He's busted. And the landowner simply says to his steward, look, I've heard what's been going on here. Get a final report together for me, for you will no longer be continuing on as my steward. And it makes me sweat a little bit. The power of those words, the pink slip, Ugh, those are not words that you ever want to hear. So with no argument, no excuses, no blame shifting, the steward begins to, in essence, start clearing out his desk. But he's got a final reckoning to prepare. And I don't know whether this is a 2-day or a 2-week reckoning that he's got to prepare. So there's a little bit of time left. Now, here's where the story gets fascinating. So far, it's pretty straightforward. It gets a little uncomfortable, too. The steward recognizes that he's now in a quandary. He starts saying to himself, what am I going to do now? I'm losing my job. I'm losing my position. He takes an inventory, and he realizes that given his age, given his physical condition, he concludes that manual labor is not an option. I can't go dig ditches for a living. And he also concludes, I am too far above that class to go sit on a street corner and beg. I'm too good for that. I won't lower myself to that. And then he has a stroke of genius. It dawns on him that he still retains power. He's got this report to get together, so he's still active. And nobody else knows about this firing yet. So he's still in a position of power, at least for a few more days or a couple more weeks. So check him out. Here's what he does. Tell me if this isn't genius. He begins to call in, one by one, each of the farmers who have been leasing a portion of the landowner's acreage. And as they come in one by one, he pulls out their personal file, if you will, and he begins a conversation going over the data in the file. And he says to farmer number 1, tell me what your arrangements are with the landowner. Tell me about your personal lease arrangements. And so farmer number 1 sits down and says, well, I've agreed to pay 900 gallons of olive oil. Now, the steward here appears to the farmers to be representing a decision on the part of the landowner. And he basically says, well, now look here, Frank. You say you owe 900 gallons of olive oil. That's a lot of oil. How are you feeling about that? And Frank, the farmer, is saying, this has not been a real good year. I don't know how in the world. So what does the steward say? He says, well, how about, Frank, would it help you at all if we just cut that in half? How about, instead of 900, let's just make that 450. Just scribble that down there and I'll sign it. That's all good. And the farmer, Frank, he's just like, Are you kidding me? You're cutting my rent in half? Oh, yeah, give me the pen. I'm signing. Thank you, thank you, thank you. This changes his whole yearly outlook. Everything changes for Frank the farmer. This is incredible. And so the guy is extremely grateful to the steward, and he goes out, and the next farmer comes in, and so on, and so on, and so on, and he does this over and over again. Of course, the parable only lists 2, but I'm assuming that by the time he's done, the entire farming community is singing the praises of Mr. Steward. They are loving this guy. He has just made their lives so much better. Things just got so much easier for them. And I would also venture to say that the landowner is looking pretty good in the eyes of the farming community too. For after all, the steward was acting with his knowledge and under his authority, right? Right? Here's the problem. No. The steward still had the authority, but he was not reflecting the interests of the landowner. He was just sneaky. And he realized that what he's done is he's just gotten an entire community of farmers indebted to him. This was his plan. So that when the firing does come down, if indeed it does come down, he's got people who love him. And who's going to look like the idiot? The landowner. So if the landowner comes home and says, "What? You mean to tell me who cut you? What? No, that's not correct. Your rent is the same. Nobody ever thought, what?" He looks like the biggest idiot in the world. He looks like Scrooge. But the steward is everybody's friend. It reminds me of politicians in an election year, doesn't it? Making promises and promising this and that to get whatever group on your side. Well, the steward has done a really good job of getting everybody on his side. So he knows he has a place to go. He has some sympathizers when and if this firing still comes down. Frankly, I'm not convinced that it would have come down because the landowner, now if he fires that steward, everybody's going to be against the landowner. Everybody's going to be on the side of the steward. How sneaky, how crafty was this guy? So he's got the entire farming community indebted to him. They love him now. So then, what is left for the landowner to do? Being a businessman, he knows shrewdness when he sees it. He said, "Man, that was pretty smooth. That was pretty sharp." Even though he's been burned big time, he's got to admit that this scoundrel is sharp. And so Jesus ends the parable. How does he end the parable? He simply says this: the landowner commended the steward for his shrewdness. Now, you and I, if you're like me, I'm about ready to pull my hair out. What, are you kidding me? Are you serious? That is not right. Does that trouble you at all? Is that the way the parable should end? The landowner commended the steward for his shrewdness. I would probably have changed the parable, but apparently Jesus knows more than I do, and apparently he had some things he wanted to teach through this. We cannot wrap our heads around the fact, guys, that Jesus would ever condone such unethical activity. Right? Do you think Jesus would condone that kind of unethical activity? How could Jesus praise such a guy? But be careful here. And this is really kind of the issue. Did Jesus really condone what this man did? Well, the answer is no. And this might help you rest your head tonight on your pillow a little bit more when you think about this parable. No. First of all, it was the landowner in the story that did the commending, not Jesus. And secondly, what the landowner did commend, and I would say even Jesus indirectly by telling the story, was not the steward's ethics, but the steward's forethought, his brilliant planning. The man was shrewd. Now, shrewd is a word that to me seems kind of negative. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and I found, well, you've got multiple definitions, as you typically do, different shades of meaning. But here is one of the definitions listed for shrewd. Shrewd is characterized by keen awareness. Is there anything wrong with being keenly aware? No, that's not a negative thing, isn't it? No, keen awareness is a good thing. Now, it says it's also being characterized by sharp intelligence. Is there anything wrong with having sharp intelligence? No, no. You should exercise sharp intelligence and be keenly aware. And it's characterized as often having a sense of the practical, knowing how to problem solve, knowing how to get it done. Is there anything wrong with that? Well, in itself, there's nothing wrong. It's actually a good thing to be a problem solver. It's actually a good thing. Now, we're not talking about how you're problem solving, but the fact that you can problem solve is actually a good thing, and I don't think Christ has any problem with that. Now, when you get to verses 8 and 9, you see Jesus starting to draw applications of this story. And it's about time because it's burning my brain up until this point. Now, look at verse 8, and here is the crux of the issue. Here is where Jesus begins to surprise us with his point. Verse 8 says this: "The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly." Stop. That's where the story ends. Now the next sentence begins Jesus' application of it. Here's where he starts to explain. He says, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light." Well, now that's just a little bit abstract. You're probably wondering, so who are the people of this world and who are the people? See the contrast there? He's contrasting people of this world with people of the light. And he wants to show a difference here. The people of this world are being contrasted with the people of the light. So who are these different groups of people? Those of you who were here last week, you may remember that we talked about a parable that said the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. And it's like a pearl merchant searching and searching and searching for the finest pearl in existence, and one day he finds it. And one of the applications that we were drawing from that is the fact that, as you live in this world, kingdom of heaven values are not running the show. We mentioned the fact that the kingdom of heaven does not hold common currency in the world that you and I are living in. The vast majority of people are not digging kingdom of heaven values. Okay? Now let's let that idea carry over into this explanation when Jesus contrasts the children of this world, or the people of this world, with the people of the light. Because I think there's a connection here. He is contrasting this sea of people who are living in this world as what I will call non-partakers in the kingdom of heaven. He's contrasting them with those who have entered into the kingdom of heaven by embracing the kingdom of heaven's king and that king's values. He's contrasting them. That's the contrast. The people of this world on the one hand and the people of the light on the other. But now what is Jesus saying about these two different collections of people, if you will? Here it is, and I'm going to tell you right now, I'm going to take a couple of different cracks at explaining this because it is kind of abstract and obtuse. So bear with me as I'll probably take 3 cracks at explaining this, all right? Here's the first one. Here's what Jesus is saying about these two groups of people, and this is important. Track with this. He says, people who are living in this world without a grasp of what true wealth even is are frequently more thoughtful in pursuit of these false values than Christ's followers are in pursuit of true values. Does that make sense? That's abstract. I think this is what Jesus is teaching us. And here's the deal, is that the children of the light, the Christ followers, should actually know better. The people of the light have insight into what is truly of value, kingdom of heaven values. Now here's whack number 2. We're going to take another whack at it, okay? I'm going to try to say the same thing a different way. Hopefully this one will grab you if the first one didn't. Jesus is saying that the children of the kingdom of this world are often brilliant in their pursuits of something that frankly is going to evaporate, whereas children of the kingdom of heaven who have the light frequently put little thought into how to live for the things that will last forever. This is what he's trying to say. And it's as if Jesus is wanting you to ask the question, what's wrong with this picture? I get the sense that Jesus wants us to sense a disconnect here. Now, Jesus refers back to the shrewdness of the steward in the story, and here's what he says in verse 9. And this is an action point. Consider it an action point to you, his followers. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth. Are there any questions as to what that is? Probably not. Some of you have a lot of it. Some of you have a negligible amount of it. It doesn't matter. He says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves. Now, that's a puzzling statement. So that when it is gone, when what is gone? You answer the question for me. Worldly wealth. Now, that doesn't mean you spent it all. That means when it no longer matters. It means when it is shown to be something that was not sufficient reason to live. When it fails, actually, I think is the RSV version of it. When it fails, when earthly wealth fails, when the kingdom of God has full sway and you realize the relative insignificance of earthly money and its stuff, he continues, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Now remember the steward? He used his influence to feather his nest. He used his influence to have a place when he no longer was employed. So Jesus is saying, there's a sense in which I want you to live that way, my children. Now, allow me one more attempt to paraphrase this complicated, abstract principle. And I'm going to put this in the mouth of Jesus. I want you to pretend it's Jesus saying this, which is always a little bit dangerous. But I think this is what he's trying to say. Jesus is saying, sometimes you, my children, are as dumb as a stump when it comes to thinking through the investment of your lives. People who are living only for the here and now, oblivious to the stuff that really matters, are far better at thinking ahead and planning about things that will ultimately evaporate than you, my followers, are about things of eternal significance. Oh, that you, my children, would understand the great resources that I've placed at your fingertips and how those resources can be used for eternal good. When will you wake up? When will you start to think and to plan about how to use all that I've given you toward ultimately important ends? I think this is what Jesus is trying to show us here. So, the parable of the unjust steward is intended then to inspire us to live with intentional emphasis on kingdom of heaven values. And I probably would be remiss if I didn't suggest to you some of the more obvious and some of the less obvious resources that God has given to you, that he's asking you to think big picture of ultimate value. What are you doing with it? How about the influence that you have? Now, this is one that you don't typically think of, and you think, well, I don't have any. Yes, you do. Some people have huge spheres of influence. Others have small spheres of influence. But you have influence with somebody. The question is, what are you doing with your influence? Another resource, obviously your money. Some of you have lots of it. Some of you have very little of it. It doesn't matter. Are you thinking about what you're doing with what you do have so that it actually conveys or carries out kingdom of heaven values as opposed to kingdom of this world values, the people of this world as opposed to the children of the light? How about your possessions, the stuff that money buys? Are you giving any thought at all to how to carry out kingdom of heaven values with what the stuff is that you, quote, own? How about this one? And this one you probably don't think of as a resource. Your time. Your time. Ben Franklin, I think it was, who said this. He says, "Dost thou love life? Then do not squander time, for it is the stuff that life is made of." The time that you have, how do you invest it so that you're accomplishing kingdom of heaven type values as opposed to just the short-sighted stuff? How about your abilities? And this is kind of an obvious one. And you look around the room, and every one of you is different. Some of you are artistic, and you stink at baseball. Others of you are really good at baseball, but you stink at art. Some of you are very, very technically minded. Others of you not so. Some of you are really skilled with the culinary stuff, or do you say culinary? Others of you, I don't want you cooking for me. Some of you are really organizationally minded. Others, it's very obvious that you are not. Some of you are very aesthetically attuned. Others of you are not. Look at these things. They're all wonderful, okay? Are you thinking at all about how to use them so that God's kind of values are advanced as opposed to stuff that just doesn't matter? How about your health? Some of you have a good health. Some of you, your health is not so good. But what about the health that you do have? How about your intelligence? Some of you are really, really smart. God gave it to you. You didn't. How about the people that are in your sphere in life? Your family members, your neighbors, your co-workers. They're uniquely yours. What are you doing with it? The opportunity, the resource. So, in short then, everything that God gives to us with which to be fruitful in life, these are the resources over which God has given us, and I'll use the word, stewardship. How much thought and creativity are you putting into working with these resources with a prayer toward producing an eternal profit for the landowner, the master? See, many of us just fiddle away at life using precious resources given to us by God for some lesser purpose than accomplishing kingdom of heaven type stuff. Now, let me point out to you verses 10 through 13 as we wrap this up. Now, I got to tell you that there's just some profound stuff in this section of verses. And remember that the Pharisees, Jesus said, the Bible says, who were lovers of money, began to sneer at Jesus for this. Now, that is an amazing expression. They began to sneer at him. And Jesus had, of course, some comments for them, which we're not going to go into. But here's what they were sneering at. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever's dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. And that's a no-brainer, right? Now look at this. So if you've not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who'll trust you with true riches? Now pause on that for a minute. He contrasts worldly wealth with what he calls true riches. So if these are true riches, apparently worldly riches are not true wealth. Are you catching that? That's very important. He says, if you can't handle this, who's going to entrust you with something that really matters? Because money apparently doesn't. Then he continues, and if you've not been trustworthy with someone else's property, remember the steward, who's going to give you property of your own? Wow. And so the Pharisees, the religious people, start sneering at him. So let me ask you, did God give you any of these resources that we just mentioned? There are so many more of them. Did he give them to you merely so that you could have a nice, comfortable life? Or is there some kind of return on investment that would bring him great joy? I don't want this message to feel like I'm bashing you over the head. I grew up with legalism and people trying to make you feel guilty for this and that, and I don't want to do that. I don't want you to feel like this is a burden or a chain of guilt hung around your neck. So I don't want you to hear this parable and think, oh, I'm terrible, I need to. No, I want to give you a sense of delight in using who God has made you to be and what he's given to you for stuff that matters. Could there be anything more delightful than bringing delight to the master? I do believe, guys, that Jesus intends this parable to be a wake-up call, a challenge for us to actually think about our lives. So I will give you 3 questions to ponder this week. So you might want to wait till all three of them are up on the screen and then take your photo. Some of you guys like to do that. So here are the questions I want you to think through. 1, what resources has God put at my disposal? Life, health, physical ability, mental ability, artistic ability, business sense, free time, gregarious personality, mechanical ability. People tend to respect you for whatever reason. That's a gift from God. 2, if I had to give an account today for the way I've intentionally invested these resources to reflect kingdom of heaven type values, would the master commend me? Think about it. 3rd, how can I be more intentional and creative in impacting people for Christ with the resources that he's put at my disposal? Or to say it differently, how can I be a better steward of these things? Let me close in prayer. Father, this is a remarkable parable. I think it's incredibly crafty. I'd say it's a shrewd parable. You really dug into something that is deep within us in a creative way to make us think about things that we might not have thought of otherwise. Lord, help us to be people who, first of all, understand the values of your kingdom and long for those values to be advanced. And Lord, sermon series could be given discussing what those values are. But we're merely alluding to them as a general group. Lord, teach us to be people who are wise enough to think about the investment of our lives. How can our lives matter? Not how can we be comfortable so much as to what matters forever and how can we be involved in that. And Lord, for anybody that has not really begun to contemplate what it would mean to make Jesus their master, I pray that this parable in some way might draw them to that, might draw them to Jesus. Thank you for the opportunity of reading and discussing this parable, and I pray that you would make it really applicable to us as we move into the week that is ahead. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.